Well, I'm back in the at this magnificent English cemetery with my beautiful friend Julia, who is the nun who takes care of this fantastic English cemetery, who's restored it, and she's had a fantastic life. Oh my God, the stories she could tell. She had a one interesting father. And let me. Here she is, Julia. Tell us about your father.
Okay, I can take this off.
Yes, yes, please
Um,
do.
my father was, uh, his father was Anglo-Irish, who came to England. He was a brilliant painter and won
Great.
a gold medal at 18. But his father was too miserly to let him go to Italy and study. So instead, he went to England and Warwick, which is a very beautiful, picturesque city. And there he was teaching watercolour to this young woman who was part of the Cash Cadbury Quaker families of Coventry. And he wanted to marry her, she wanted to marry him, and all of the relatives said, no, you can't marry a starving artist.
Mm,
And eventually, the young couple managed to wear down the older people's
mm, mm. Resistance.
resistance.
Yes.
And they married, and their first child was my father, who
Ah.
they called Robin.
Mm.
And then the second child was Eileen, and the third child was Joyce, and the fourth child was Frederick.
Hmm.
At which point the Quaker relative showed up and said, didn't you know there was a way not to have children? Uh, then my father, well, my grandfather and father went off on a painting holiday, and they were climbing a hill, and it got harder and harder for my grandfather.
Hmm.
And they came back to Warwick, and he had they had polio,
Oh.
and he died, and my father was lame from it. And so there was this family of orphans, and my grandmother was able to sort of write letters and get. Joyce went to the Blue Coat School, which was, De Quincy's and Coleridge's school, and I got her Bible from the coat of arms of
Mm.
the
Mm.
king and so
Mm.
forth. Um, Robin managed to get into one of the Woodward schools, and in the sixth form, he didn't get into sixth form. At fifth form, the First World War broke out, and you could hear the cannons.
Oh.
And eventually, all of the cricket 11, the schoolboys, the sixth form boys, had gone off and were killed in the trenches. And he was realizing that the teaching he was getting, because most of the masters were also at the front, and he was reading Lamb's essay about the Bodleian Library,
Mm. Mm.
and
Beautiful.
remember the books.
Oh my
And
God.
yes.
Yes. Yes.
So he sat down and wrote a
Yeah.
letter to the Bodleian Library asking if he could be one of the boys fetching books.
Ah.
He was 14. And they wrote back saying, Master Bolton, there's no work for you. So he showed up, and they begrudgingly allowed him to be one of the boys. They weren't being paid enough, and he was very run down also with the flu afterwards. And my grandmother also had it and described having these bulbos like the
Ah.
bubonic plague
Ah.
and what.
Ah. You
And
mean about the
in 1918,
oh,
flu
the
epidemic.
famous
Yes.
Spanish flu.
Yeah.
Mm. Mm.
And but my father was struggling to get his degree, and was a poor scholar, so he was part of St Catherine's Society. He wasn't in a real college. St Catherine's has now become a very fine real college, and he flunked his divinity paper because he was a server at St Bartholomew's, and the priests abused him, orphan, canon fodder. He went off because he realised he had to be helping support his family. His younger brother went to Cambridge
Mm.
and was
Cambridge.
studying theology. And so my father got a job working for the Yorkshire Post in where he heard about my great-grandfather, who was Sir James Roberts, who had walked across the moors as a poor boy without shoes to work in the mills, and then eventually became owner of Saltaire. And so, you know, this was sort of my father from his poverty, seeing the wealth of Saltaire. Then from Yorkshire Post he went out to India, where he was an editor for the Times of India.
Editor for the Times of England.
And he was interviewing Ghandi when Ghandi was in prison, and wrote his first book on Ghandi.
Really?
And was on the Salt March, covering it for the
Incredible.
Times of India. Yes.
He meets Gandhi, and he was he was in the Salt March with Gandhi.
Right. And also when he went, no, but he didn't interview Gandhi in prison. That was later. He went and interviewed him in the ashram.
Yeah.
And Gandhi played a joke on him, and wrote an interview of my father, this blonde-haired, blue-eyed Englishman. And because Gandhi had a wonderful sense of humour.
Yeah.
And
what did your father say about
the Salt March?
About the Salt March?
That it was history very quietly being made.
History very quietly being made.
That was in a BBC broadcast.
Really?
With Lord Irwin and Nehru and the others and so forth. And then he came back to England, went to Canada to fly back to England on the R100. And in Canada he met my mother, who was Sir James Roberts' granddaughter. And she was furious because the captain of the R100 was refusing to allow any women on board.
So in other words, your mother came from noble extraction?
Not really, Anglo-Irish.
Anglo-Irish,
His ancestor was Sir Richard Burton, who was Lord Chancellor of Ireland and so forth. But Ireland is genteel poverty, and we deserved it, you know, because we treated the tenants very badly, and which the English don't know, but Anglo-Irish do. And so that was my parents' first meeting. Then my father, back in England, was doing freelance journalism, writing leaders. One leader he wrote was advising Mussolini not to form the alliance with Hitler, that Italy was a country of such a fine culture that this would not be the road to take. And Mussolini wrote to him asking him to come and explain this to
Really?
him. But my father didn't go.
But, so
Too
Mussolini
dangerous. This was during the time of fascism.
asked him to go, but your father didn't go.
No.
Yeah.
And then my father and mother married, and they wrote together a very lovely book called Two Lives Converge, where they each do a chapter, and it's dedicated to me.
Wow.
And it's lovely.
And the name of the book is Two Lives Converge, dedicated to you.
Yeah.
Your mother and your father wrote the book.
Right.
And
It was when the marriage was still good. It didn't stay good. And
marriages do like that.
And then my brother was born, and he was named Richard after Sir Richard Burton and so forth. And of course in England you pay for the boy's education, so he was sent to Shrewsbury and went to a dreadful prep school first where they abused him, and I went to a cheap convent, Anglican convent school. And then my father was between books and there was no more money to pay for my school fees, so they sent me off to America at 16. And I was dreadfully homesick.
To California, as I recall.
Yes. And I got my degree in 3.5 years from 16 to, and
from what university?
it was San Jose State.
San Jose State.
In where
English?
I was studying Spanish because I wanted to understand the Spanish culture.
Yeah.
And I went to Mexico when I was 17, to Monterrey and Saltillo. And then I married my husband. He needed to marry to get his teaching credential because he was rather clearly gay, and they wouldn't give it to him on that basis. And we had 3 children, and he did not want children. He did not want
He did
to be
not want
married.
children. Yeah.
So in the end, it was divorce from extreme mental and physical cruelty, and I went with
So
the children.
your divorce was extremely painful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I vowed not to be like my parents,
Yeah.
that it was forever.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
And so,
We all start out that way.
yes, idealistic. And so I went to Berkeley with the 3 children during the time of the,
Yeah.
well, I wasn't there, the free speech movement, yeah. I was
What year are we talking about now?
the 1970s.
1970s.
I can remember Angela Davis and
Angela
Herbert Marcuse speaking in the
my
Brown Plaza and so forth. And we were working against the Vietnam War. And when the Franciscans hired me while I was writing my dissertation, and the psychology department wanted to hire another Berkeley PhD. The friar said,
So you
not
got your
a second
PhD.
one. Yes, they
You
said
got your
not a second one.
Oh, yeah.
And so I was the only Berkeley PhD they had. But very quickly I got an NEH summer seminar at Princeton, and then Princeton hired me for 7 years.
For 7 years you taught there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also was able to teach in Woodrow Wilson School Problems of World Hunger. The students and I initiated the seminar during the Sahel. And Jonathan was very good about that. My son, he was extremely high IQ, and this sort of became his life work. He was feeding the street people from his van called Everybody's Kitchen in
Everybody's
Washington,
Kitchen was called.
Philadelphia, and New York.
Well, this literary bent runs in the family. It was called Everybody's Kitchen. Well, that's
Yes, and it was a school bus and so forth, and step van and everything.
Yeah.
And that's where my grandchildren were, and granddaughters. And then I was teaching at Boulder, Colorado, when I failed to get tenure at Princeton. No women at that point could.
Oh, they wouldn't. They didn't give you tenure.
No,
Yeah.
and they told us that when they hired us.
Oh, really? Yeah.
There were black professors before there were women professors, and we were.
And so then you went to Colorado?
Yes, and taught at Boulder and was director of medieval studies, and gave it all up to go back to my convent school, the school had closed. The nuns who were my teachers it had been such a beautiful place and had become terrible, and I wanted to try to bring it back.
Yeah.
And after 4 years, the bishops took all of the endowment.
Yeah.
Ciao e grazie. Thank you so much.